Martin with Magic City Books. I'm so thrilled to have you here with us tonight for our continuing virtual author series, which we've been doing 2 or 3 a week since April, and I think we're well over 80 events that we've done. Had all kinds of amazing people. It's been, it's been a weird time, but we've gotten to have some really fun conversations with kinds of all authors all over the map, and we're going to continue doing that. I would imagine we'll be doing these well into the spring, and we'll kind of then take it from there and see where we go. You can go to magiccitybooks.com and kind of see what's coming up. We just announced a really great event with Ta-Nehisi Coates and Damon Lindelof, the creator of Watchmen, are going to be in conversation. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a piece for The Atlantic years ago called The Case for Reparations, which he mentioned the Tulsa Race Massacre, which we'll be talking about a little bit tonight too. And that's where Damon Lindelof, who also created The Leftovers and Lost and other shows, saw that. And that was kind of the spark that led to what happened with Watchmen and having it set in Tulsa and having that be kind of the inciting incident for that show. So that's going to be a really great conversation. That's a ticketed event. It's going to be just around the corner, actually. It's going to be on November 30th, and tickets are on sale now. And you get a copy of Ta-Nehisi's wonderful debut novel, The Water Dancer, which I think just today or yesterday was announced is going to be becoming a major motion picture as well. So go to our website, and you can see all the fun stuff we have coming up for that. I want to say a big shout out to my friend Tim over at Tulsa People magazine, who did an interview with Matt and kind of greased the wheels for getting this conversation going. And we're at a wonderful interview. So if you haven't had a chance to see that, I would encourage you to go find that and check it out. I'm sure many of you have had a chance to see the television show of Lovecraft Country, but there's as with any adaptation, the source material is usually quite different, and the journey from the page to the screen is quite interesting, we could say, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But if you don't know Matt's work, he's written a lot of wonderful novels. Most recently, though, this spring, wrote the book 88 Names, which you'll see there perched above his shoulder when we turn it over to Matt. And if you haven't read Bad Monkeys or any of these other books, you can just load up on Backlist. It's the time for the gift giving season. If you loved Lovecraft Country and like what Matt does, you're going to enjoy his other work as well. You can go to Matt's website. It's buymattruff.com. That's B-Y, not B-U-Y, although we'd like you to B-U-Y some of these books, but buymattruff.com. So I want to say a big thank you and welcome to Matt for joining us. Thanks, Matt.
Well, thanks for having me. And so people who go there, if you look at my blog, I recently did a blog post where I did a sort of an explainer for people who've read Lovecraft Country and want to know what to read next, because I do have this weird reputation of never writing the same book twice. They're all very different, and it's always hard for me to tell people what to recommend next if they like a particular novel, because they're all very different. So this blog post will give you some ideas, at least what you'll be getting into with each specific title. So hopefully give you some help.
Yeah, it's very like, my favorite director is Stanley Kubrick, and one of the things I always loved about Stanley Kubrick is, he would do like every genre of movie. So it'd be like the horror movie, then a war movie, then a science fiction movie, and a comedy. Kind of touched all those bases, but the consistency was it was the same person. You could still see kind of a through line and kind of an authorship, even though the genres and styles all stay the same. And I think that your work obviously has that as well. I mean, there's nothing really, like you said, each one's kind of its own different thing. You're not trying to kind of create this extended universe of Matt, but I think
no, that's a trap, because there just comes a point where you lose the continuity and stuff starts contradicting itself. And no, but it's funny because when I did actually have to go back to my very first novel a few years ago, because the ebook edition had been created at a time when they were still scanning using optical character recognition to create the ebooks, and so inevitably there are dozens of typos. So people had been complaining to me about this, so I finally went back and reread it and fixed these typos. And it was striking to me that there were just certain stylistic tics that I had even back then that I would have thought were more recent. So my voice has been somewhat consistent over time. Fool on the Hill, yeah.
Which has been, that came out a long time ago. When did that book come out? Like,
1988 it was published, and
I mean, you were,
yeah, that was my college senior thesis, actually. I
yeah,
took
man, what were you, like 23 years old or something when that came out?
22. I had just graduated, and yeah, it was my college thesis for honors English, and one of my professors was the novelist Allison Laurie, and she very generously introduced me to her agent, Melanie Jackson, in Manhattan. And Melanie liked my work and sold the book 6 months after I graduated. So I thought I had it made. And of course, the getting a book published is only the first step, unless you're one of those, unless lightning really strikes and you become a bestseller, which I did not, but at least I was on my way. And yeah, and then I've had the good fortune to have publishers who were willing to let me write whatever I wanted to write, even though they didn't really logically fit together, and it made life for my publicist very difficult. Like how do I do this? You're in every different genre. How do I introduce your next book? But eventually that became my brand. So
Right. That's your brand. That's good. That's a good brand. I mean, I think some people, it's the opposite, not getting basically typecast as a certain kind of author, and having the freedom to kind of explore whatever interests you at that given moment.
yeah,
So I think, we need to talk about Lovecraft Country, of course, and the show has been such a huge success, and we were talking before we came on here about how it's, turned the book into a bestseller. And one of the probably more interesting things for you, I would imagine, is the entry point for people is the show, but then going back to the book, of course, it's quite different in many ways than the show, and the show took a lot of different liberties as far as how
yeah.
this.
I mean, for me, it's not. I mean, it's funny. It became more different as the season went on, and also I was not directly involved in the production, so I got a sneak peek at the first few episodes, but I was seeing it at the same time as everybody else, especially towards the end. So that was a really interesting experience as the two, universes started to diverge a little bit. But I was very happy with how it turned out, and I had given Misha my blessing to I've got my version of the story. You go ahead and do what you want to do, and I'm very pleased with how it turned out. But yes, from the first, it was like it captured the spirit of the novel, but for me, it's like watching this parallel universe where I recognize the broad strokes and the characters and the features, but everything's a little bit different, and some things are obviously very different, and it diverges more as it goes along. So that was a fun ride. And then watching the public reaction as well, which I had never got to do before. So that was just a lot of fun.
I've always been, I would not call myself a, major fan of science fiction or fantasy, but I am interested in the side of it that kind of deals with, social issues and how it's always been used, I think in its best ways as a kind of a Trojan horse to bring bigger ideas to, into play here. And obviously that's not much of a surprise with what you were trying to do with Lovecraft Country. You obviously are very upfront about the time period and what you're dealing with and how you're kind of incorporating those two things together. But what's your relationship like to that genre? I mean, was it something growing up that you were really interested in, especially even like the works of H.P. Lovecraft? Did you like horror? Did you like those kind of stories of the fantastic and the macabre?
Oh yeah, I'm a big nerd and always was. I have to say that when I was a kid, I don't remember when I first encountered Lovecraft, but when I was young, I didn't really appreciate what he got right because I was growing up in the '70s, and I his specialty is this sort of slow building dread, which my younger self read as nothing's happening. Where is the monster? Why is it not here yet? And it wasn't until I got older and was able to appreciate what he was doing, I was like, oh yeah, this is actually really good. But as a kid, and then his language, he never uses one word where 20 will do, and he does use a lot of. Again, the way his characters talk actually does make sense, but he just uses words that I had no idea what they meant at the time. So it wasn't until I was older that I could really appreciate what he got right. And I think I did appreciate his imitators a bit more because they sort of incorporated the best of what he did with the more modern sensibility and had a little more happen. So obviously Stephen King went down that road a number of times, and John Carpenter and film. And but I was a big lover of all things fantastic as a kid. but I didn't really differentiate. Like I was never much. I was an only child. I kind of made up my own rules about what I liked and didn't like, and I never felt like I really had to categorize things strictly one way or another. And so it was always kind of odd when I ran into people who were very clear on what they felt the distinction between science fiction and fantasy was, for example, and what kinds of horror were good and what kinds weren't. And I just read what interested me, and if I got bored, I'd set something aside and try something different.
You know,
and yes, oh, go ahead.
I was always, one of the things that it kind of drives me crazy. I talk about this a lot, is kind of categorization in bookstores and how we kind of put things in little boxes, because I think in some ways it keeps people from merging into lanes they may not otherwise go into, because you kind of follow your path of interest mostly. But then there are these writers, who are genre writers, but they, for some reason, maybe it's time, maybe it's critical acclaim, but they'll kind of at some point get accepted into the quote literary canon, and they're not seen as kind of genre. I would think somebody like, for example, like a Kurt Vonnegut or like a Ray Bradbury or Ursula Le Guin or they at some point something switched. And for a long time they were just magazine writers writing stories and doing all these things, and they were not really appreciated in the kind of the halls of the literati. But now, they're kind of seen on the same par and same level as, Philip Roth or, like a John Updike.
Oh, sure.
And do you think that that's just something that happens? I don't know. How we judge things.
Well, part of this has always been public relations. It's just how you're sold in the first place. I mean, and I had this experience with my first novel, which was a comic fantasy and could very easily have been pitched as just genre fantasy. And in fact, the original cover art for Full in the Hill looked very much like a classic genre novel. And fortunately, my publisher at the time said, we don't want to limit you this way. It's like the people who like fantasy are going to find this book no matter what. What we want to do is be open to people who think they don't like fantasy, but will like this if we can get them to pick it up. And so he rejected the initial art and had them use a more ambiguous cover that could be fantasy but could also be lit. And I didn't particularly care one way or the other, but in hindsight I realized that was a very fortunate thing, because I never got typed as a genre or a specific type of genre. And that's really the hard thing with genres. That's where you do tend to get cubbyholed, or at least used to get cubbyholed in one type of genre fiction. It's not just that you're not in the lit sphere, because there's not necessarily a lot of money in the lit sphere anyway. Genre is where you can make a living, but where you're expected to be either a horror writer or a science fiction writer or something. And because I got this sort of neat straddle, I was allowed to just do whatever combination of genres I felt like doing that would fit whatever story I was trying to tell. And that worked out well for me. The other thing too is I think just as time has gone on, these separation of the walls has sort of come down a bit, so that there's no longer, people are not likely to be as pigeonholed now as they once were. And the separation even between literary fiction and genre fiction is not as great. I mean, Marvel has conquered the universe with the movies, so I don't think people care as much as they once did. There are still some old folks who complain about it or who think the way they did when they were younger, but I just don't see it as a big deal going forward.
You studied writing, and like you said, your first book was your thesis project and all that, and you studied with some really great people like Alison Lurie and people like this. Was the writing you were doing then different than your classmates? Were they going kind of straight more into that literary space, and you were still kind of doing talking dogs and Greek gods and different things like that?
I mean, I think the main difference was I had started much earlier than most of my peers. I mean, I figured out, I'm one of these people who came wired from the factory knowing what they wanted to do. So I from the time I was about 5, I was already thinking, oh yes, I want to tell stories for a living. And I was always drawn to long fiction. So I basically spent my childhood and adolescence teaching myself how to write novels. And again, because I'm self-taught that way, that's probably another reason why my ideas about what works and what doesn't are different. I didn't get mentored by people who tried to tell me how it was supposed to be done. And by the time I encountered people who had those ideas, I was already stuck in my own way of thinking. So, and even at Cornell, I mean, I took creative writing in English, not because I necessarily wanted to study it, but because I wanted to get credit for what I knew I was going to be doing anyway. So,
what
which
you
is all.
was having kind of, instead of kind of molded you, it's more like honed the work and craft that you already had. And
right. And I encountered people who gave me good advice and got me to listen to them. But it wasn't like I needed, a lot of it I had already figured out on my own the way I wanted to handle it. So, so the main thing by the time I got to Cornell, I had already been doing, like I had written an unpublished novel. I'd been trying to write novels from the time I was very young, and I finally finished one called The Gospel According to St. Thomas, which is it was a story about a Lutheran minister's son, much like myself, who was losing his faith and trying to deal with that. And I wrote that in part as a way of sort of letting my parents know I wasn't going to grow up to be the devout Christian they wanted me to be. And because I cared about it, like, I don't know if it was a very good book, but the fact that I cared about the message and the story got me to finish it and prove to myself, okay, I can actually finish a novel project if I want to. And then I got to Cornell and I was ready to start working on something I could actually sell. And the thing is, a lot of my peers were still doing that thing. There was this belief that, well, no, you don't write the novel first. You write short stories first and work your way up to a big project. And looking back at that, I'm like, well, no, those are completely different skill sets. I mean, what it takes to write a good short story is very different than what it takes to write long fiction. Some people can do both. Some people are really better at one than the other. So yeah, I have this memory of being in an early creative writing class at Cornell, and the teacher had everybody go around the room and talk about what they had done and what they were working on. And people were like, well, I've done, short story this and short story that. And then this woman sitting next to me said, well, I've done a couple of short stories. And then she kind of laughed and said, and I'm taking notes for a novel. And they got to me and I'm like, well, I wrote a novel when I was in high school, and I'm working on this other novel now. And it was just like, and it sounded like I was bragging, but mostly it was just like, I'd been doing this and I was past the screwing around phase, and I was just ready to go do something that, I could actually do something with. So that was the biggest distinction, I think. And in terms of the subject matter, I didn't really think about it. If I had had an idea that was like super literary, I would have been just as happy to do that. But what I happened to like was this weird combination of genres instead.
Yeah. There's a term that I think we don't hear much anymore, but it was so prevalent for such a long time, which was this thing called the mid-list author, right? And for those who don't know what that is, that's basically an author who could have a career writing books, and that would be their actual job. They're not, working as a waiter somewhere. This is their actual job, and their books sell consistently enough to kind of make back their publication and all these things, and they can keep writing. And that, in some ways, unfortunately, has kind of dwindled. And you don't have many what we call mid-list authors anymore, because everything's kind of like either high or low. There's not much middle ground there.
Yeah.
But you've been publishing books now for 30 plus years. And you said your best-selling book before the relaunch of Lovecraft Country was Bad Monkeys.
Yeah.
And so, but you've been able to kind of do your work for 30 odd years.
Yeah.
Is something that if you had been just starting now and kind of didn't start in the 80s, do you think you could have the same career that you've had these last few decades?
It's hard to say, probably not. I mean, it was a weird confluence of events. First of all, it just shouldn't have worked out. Doing what I did, taking English, not because I wanted to learn necessarily from people, but just because I wanted to get credits. Like I was one of these people, I wanted the college experience, and I figured, well, let me take this thing, let me take English because that sort of fits in with my interests. But that was actually quite stupid, because I had no desire to teach, and really the only other thing I could have done with that degree was become a teacher. So if the novel writing career had not worked out, I probably would have ended up working at a video store or something, which is absurd, to go to an Ivy League school and then use that degree to do something that you don't need a college degree for at all. But I was just, I had the opportunity to go to college, and I took it, and it actually worked out in terms of the contacts I got by being there, and meeting Allison Lurie and having her introduce me to Melanie Jackson, my agent for the past 33 years, who's basically made my career possible.
Yeah.
That was worth the entire college tuition right there. But that was not a conscious plan. That was just, I got lucky.
Yeah.
And if I had had it to do over again, I would probably, assume that I was not going to be able to make a living at writing for a very long time, if ever. And I would try to have a money-making plan that I would, not hate, something I would enjoy doing that would leave me plenty of time and energy to be creative. I'm not sure what that would be, but it would just, it would probably be something odd. Like I've thought about this sometimes, like night watchman maybe, or a fire watcher out in the wilderness somewhere where I could just sit up in a tower and talk to myself all day. That would be the kind of thing, rather than the kind of job you sort of fall into because, oh my God, you didn't sell your book, or you did, but it didn't become a bestseller and now your money is running out. So what are you going to do? Oh, I'll become a waiter. And then you're just not going to have any energy at the end of the day. So yeah, I got lucky, and then I kept getting lucky. Part of it was I wasn't married. I never learned to drive, so I didn't have car payments. So I could just pick a relatively inexpensive part of the country to live in. I ended up in Maine, and I just, I was poor and in debt, but I could afford to be poor. I didn't mind it, and I just kept writing. And there were always little windfalls along the way every time I started to get in dire circumstances. One of the things that really helped was that Fool on the Hill was translated into German, published by a publishing house called Karl Hanser Verlag. And I was actually more popular in Germany for many years than I was here, and that the money from those foreign sales just kept me afloat until my second novel came out. And I got to go to Europe on book tour, and this was, I don't know if they still do this, but back in the 80s and 90s, when you went to book tour in Germany, they would pay you to do readings. You would get, you do your reading, and then the bookseller would take you out to a nice restaurant, and then you would get a big envelope full of Deutschmarks. And part of that was the State Department, as part of their propaganda effort to keep the Western Europe on our side, would sort of fund cultural events like this. So that was part of the money was being funneled back to people to do that. But so there were things like that where you just, I was able to get enough money that I didn't end up living in the woods somewhere, and then slowly got enough success that I was able to keep going. And then Bad Monkeys elevated my visibility. It was Bad Monkeys that led me to this, this epic meeting with a couple of TV producers who invited me to pitch them ideas for original series. And that was where I initially came up with the idea for Lovecraft Country in 2007. I had initially pitched it as a possible TV show, and it was only after they were not interested in that I figured out how to turn it into a novel. So
oh, that's interesting.
So yeah.
Our check is in the mail. If you don't get it, let me know for the reading.
Yeah. Like I said, I don't think even the Germans do that anymore.
Mail's running really slow right now, so I apologize if it's not there yet. You kind of mentioned Lovecraft Country. Let's talk about that for a little bit. Like you just said, I didn't know that actually, that this was kind of started as more of a TV project, and you kind of turn it into a novel, and then obviously it circled back around to that. But what's it been like, kind of the journey? Obviously, the book came out 2016.
Yeah.
Book comes out 2016. Obviously, we're 2020. The show comes out. That's 4 years. It's been a wild 4 years. Lots of stuff going on. But I'm sure there have been a lot of stops and starts, or has it been like the minute you found out it was like going? Because you hear about so many people who sell rights, and it never materializes. But has this been a fairly straight journey, or has it had lots of stops and starts?
Well, yeah. Prior to Lovecraft Country, my big experience with rights sales was Bad Monkeys, which has been optioned numerous times. Currently, Universal has the option, and with Margot Robbie attached to star. And I still think that may happen, but that one's just been, I've been waiting and waiting for Bad Monkeys to become either a movie or a TV series for a decade now, more than a decade, actually a decade and a half, I guess. Lovecraft Country, no, that was really a wild confluence. Again, I got incredibly lucky that the book, because when I had initially pitched it, the idea of this sort of X-Files story, but with a Black family living in Chicago in 1954, that the idea of a mostly Black cast, period piece, so it's going to be expensive, and then it's going to be about racism. And that was just, in 2007, that was just a little too out there for TV. And but I really loved the idea, and I eventually figured out how to make it work as a novel, and with this hope that maybe if the book was good enough, it could serve as a proof of concept that, yeah, so you could really do something with this. What happened in my case, though, is great timing that I finished Lovecraft Country just as Jordan Peele was working on Get Out, starting to think about what he was going to do next. And so Lovecraft Country came out, and right away the culture had changed enough that right away there was a lot more interest in the idea as a possible development, TV or film idea than there had been 10 years earlier. But one of the odd things, my CIA agent called up and said, this is really strange, but apparently Jordan Peele wants to talk to you. And I'm not sure why. He's known for comedy, but apparently he's trying to break into horror. And I was happy to talk to him. And then I found out Misha Green was going to be there. And I was familiar with her work on Underground, which for people who don't know is basically the Great Escape set on a slave plantation. So I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. And we had a really wonderful conversation where we were all, excited about the book for the same reasons. And I was very happy to sign on with them. And it was shortly after that the first trailer to Get Out appeared. And that was when I realized, oh, okay, it's obvious now why Jordan Peele was interested in this. And basically the success of Get Out completely paved the way. At that point, Jordan Peele could have done anything he wanted. And I just happened to be the lucky guy to get the first golden ticket. And so where normally you would pitch this to a network and then you maybe shoot a pilot episode and see what they thought of it. In this case, it was like he went to HBO and HBO was like, no, we're gonna, yes, we'll give you the full season right away. Go ahead, do it. And so even though it's taken 4 years from that, that the book being published and the series coming out, it's been as smooth a ride as I could possibly have asked for. So I think it was 2017 we found out that the TV deal was happening, and then they shot the pilot in actually the end of 2018, and then most of the series was shot towards the end of 2019, and we just got in under the wire. I think they finished principal photography in January of this year, so right before COVID started happening. If it had been even a month or two later, I don't know if the show would have come out on time, but
yeah. And timing plays such a huge factor in this. You said that, when the book came out, there always are conversations happening about race in America, but we were in a moment still even then about some of the violence and police brutality issues that we're still dealing with today. But of course, this year it blew up even larger before the show came out. And that had to have had an impact kind of on where the show was going and those conversations. I guess my question to you is was there ever a version of this book that wasn't kind of set in that Jim Crow South era, and would it work if it weren't? Obviously the adventure components of it and the story in itself is kind of universal in a sense, just the kind of the investigation component. But was that like the starting point when you were kind of thinking about it? It's like the setting and the time and that social component was always right there.
Oh yeah. The way I thought of it, again, my initial, like Lovecraft kind of came in a little bit later. It initially was, I wanted to do a story like the X-Files, where you had a recurring cast of characters having weekly paranormal adventures. And the way I thought of it was, well, the first question you have to figure out is, what job do these people have that has them encountering supernatural monsters every week? Because most people, you maybe get one night at a haunted house or, one blurry glimpse of Bigfoot, and that's your lifetime quota. So what's special about these folks that they're constantly running into monsters? And the traditional answer has been something like, well, they work for the government, or, maybe it's Kolchak the Night Stalker. He's a reporter who's known to like these kinds of things. And I wanted to do something a little different that would allow you to talk about other issues besides just, I love the genre stuff, and that was definitely a part of the thing, but I also wanted to figure out a way to bring in real life and add this sort of additional layer of richness. And so I was like, well, basically the answer I came up with is that the reason they're encountering monsters all the time is because they're Black people living in America in the middle of the 20th century. And as soon as I thought of that, I was like, yeah, that's a show, that's a story, I want to do this. And so there was never a version that wasn't that. It was always going to be this Black family. They own a travel agency. They live in Chicago in the 1950s and publish a fictional version of the Green Book. And my my Fox Mulder character, who I came to call Atticus Turner, is a field researcher for the guide whose job is to drive around the country looking for places that will take his business. And and he's a big nerd, so I can also talk about the difficulties of being a Black nerd and loving genres of fiction that don't love you back, and that's another big thing. And so if he encounters a monster, he will know what the rules are, how to deal with that. And then at the same time, he's also dealing with all of the historical horror of segregation and Jim Crow, and that just offers so many storytelling possibilities. As soon as I had that in my head, I was like, yeah, this will work. And unfortunately, I just couldn't get that first group of television people to agree with me on that, or to see it. And I just probably wasn't a very good pitchman for it. But fortunately, my publisher had a little more faith in me. And Lovecraft, came into it because I did need this thematic bridge between the two types of horror, paranormal horror and white supremacy. And Lovecraft is both. He is a very important and very talented horror writer, but he was also very much a vocal white supremacist who, didn't really believe in democracy either, because democracy meant that you had to actually give the vote to all kinds of people who you didn't really regard as fully human. So that became the title just became sort of a double entendre for, the paranormal landscape where monsters come from, but also white America. So
that's a great point too, because I think some people that may not have read the book or don't understand that might see this as a championing of H.P. Lovecraft as opposed to a commentary on H.P. Lovecraft, which it very much is. People think because he was a problematic figure in that regard. But at the same time, it kind of makes you hold two things in your head at once, right? Obviously, he's a major influence and talent on the world we live in, and there's no Stephen King, like you said, without people like that kind of paving the way. But at the same time, when you look at his personal takes on certain things, it's pretty horrific in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah, he was. Although as I discovered, when I was, I never lacked for examples whenever I was trying to reference in the novel, talking about, again, the difficulties of a Black genre fan. There were, everybody had something back then. It's like, okay, I'm going to do, one of the stories is kind of a Jekyll and Hyde take. One of the chapters is kind of a Jekyll and Hyde take. And so I went back to Robert Louis Stevenson, and, there too, sure enough, he's got, Dr. Jekyll is this, beautiful, fair-skinned white man, and then Hyde is this swarthy, dark-skinned. He's not Black, but it's more like Eastern European, maybe kind of Jewish, but still.
Other, yeah.
Yeah, the idea that, yeah, exactly. And in Stevenson's case, that may have just been, lazy stereotyping. In Lovecraft's case, it's an expression of a much more deeply held belief system that, really, white people, and specifically blonde, blue-eyed Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, represent the pinnacle of human evolution and the pinnacle of human culture. And then there's this sort of pyramid, and Black folks aren't even really on the scale; they're just somewhere down here. But so it's Lovecraft is way out there. But this stuff is just all over the genre, so I never lacked for things to bring up if I wanted to point to just the difficulty you would have as a reader at that time.
I wonder when the book came out versus when the show came out, having people like Jordan Peele and Misha Green behind the show. One, have you had a lot of readers surprised that you're not Black, having read the book? I'm sure people who come to the book and, probably just assume that it's by a Black author. And two, have you had any pushback about, writing this book and being a white author? I'm just curious if you've had any conversations about that.
Not as many as I would have expected. I think there are two different groups you were sort of dealing with this. The group I was more concerned with are Black readers, because I just figured they would be a tough crowd, because not without reason they are skeptical of the ability of any white author to do a good job with this, because there is a history and track record here of white authors vastly overestimating their ability to understand Black culture, and part of that is just the state of criticism has been so poor, where again a lot of it was white critics who either didn't notice stereotyping or didn't care about it, gave it a free pass, and then if a white author actually tried to capture the Black experience, then they got applauded and for just making the effort, even if the result was terrible. And so I think Black readers quite reasonably became very, very skeptical, and some of them, kind of blew way past skepticism and just sort of an out and out fatalism, like it's like, don't even try, we're tired. Please don't keep trying to do this. So I knew that I would have to not be lazy. I would have to do a good job, and if I screwed this up, I would probably hear about it and get some angry emails. But that wasn't a reason not to do it. That was just a reason to make sure I did a good job. And you can win over a tough crowd if you don't take them for granted, and if you don't act like they owe it to you to like your stuff. And I've been writing about, my whole career, with the partial exception of my first novel, almost, my protagonists are not clones of me. I like using fiction to get into the heads of people who are from different cultures or different backgrounds, who may share certain things with me, but who have other challenges and things I don't experience. And that's part of the joy of what fiction lets you do. And even though this is a particularly fraught subject, I've been doing this long enough that I figured if I couldn't pull it off, I would figure that out long before I embarrassed myself in public. Yeah. So, and the verdict from that readership has been quite positive, I think. Obviously, the fact that, it helps a lot when Jordan Peele sort of gives you the seal of approval. You're kind of okay. There is another group of, progressive liberals. These are actually mostly white folks who, I think for ideological reasons, are just uncomfortable with the idea of, people writing about an identity that isn't their own. And
it's part of the cultural appropriation conversation, I guess, is where it kind of lands at some point.
And I guess to me, the problem I always have is that another way of expressing that is that it's somehow respectful of people to treat them as a taboo subject. And I just don't, I understand how you could convince yourself of that, but I just don't think it's true. And I just don't think it's worth paying attention to. So occasionally I will hear something from somebody grumbling from that corner, but I just don't really care because I just don't agree with the basic premise. And if all the argument you have to say is, well, I didn't read the book, but you just don't look like the right kind of person to have written this, that's not really an argument that I care about. If you read the book and you can point to something I did horribly wrong or that just doesn't work, then there might be something there I need to listen to. But if it's just like, oh, I don't like your face, it's the wrong color, well, okay, read something else. But there really has not been much along that line. And again, I think partly because I don't go out of my way to pick fights with people online. I think that's where that tends to happen. So
yeah, you mentioned the episodic nature of the show, of course, and the book itself has that component too, where I could see endless adventures and endless kind of stories here. I'm curious, I don't know if there's been a second season announced for the show, but have you kind of been approached or thought about any kind of follow-up projects related to this, the further adventures, or kind of going down this road again, like as maybe not a sequel, but kind of an additional set of misadventures or stories here?
They haven't made a decision yet on whether there's going to be a second season. I know Misha's interested in it, and I think it'll just be a question of whether she can come to terms with HBO, and then also what is the pandemic going to continue to do with filming schedules? Like, how is that going to work? As far as me, I'm generally not a sequel guy. But this is really likely to be an exception. I have not been able to get the story and the characters out of my head since I finished it. So I'm actually not doing something different, but I just want to go back and write a sequel. And I've actually written about 25,000 words of a sequel. The only real issue I have is that if I dive back into this world, it wouldn't just be one more book. It would be at least 2 and possibly 3. And I write very slowly, and I don't want to. I'd like George Martin's bank account, but I don't really want to turn into George R.R. Martin in terms of stringing people out for 10 years.
Yeah.
The interesting thing with the success of the show, and particularly if the show continues, and what's great about the difference is that I think the show is going to diverge and go in a direction very different from what I would want to do in a sequel in a novel. And that kind of intrigues me, the idea of having because if you've seen the series, there is this reference to the multiverse, and they sort of give a shout out to my novel by having Atticus at one point bring back a version of Lovecraft Country from a parallel dimension that sounds suspiciously like my novel, except that it's written by Atticus's son. And so it'd be kind of cool actually to have HBO continuing in one direction, Misha continuing with her vision in one direction, me doing what I've been thinking about doing in another direction, and seeing if you could actually make that work. Two, not entirely different, but still significantly different versions of the same story being created simultaneously. Like there's certainly been cases in the past where you've had a completed series that was then adapted and changed significantly, and there have been stories that have been rebooted or told multiple times that change each time. But the idea of doing two at once that are not quite the same, I don't know that I've ever seen that, and I'm kind of intrigued by trying to do that. Plus, I just really want to tell more. I've got more I want to say with these folks. So I'm gonna write another. I've written about 25,000 words. I need to get another 25,000 in the bank, and then I'm gonna have a conversation with my agent and my publisher and see. Just so I don't wake up, 10 years from now thinking, oh, if only I had done this. So
that makes sense. I'm curious. You mentioned kind of the divergent paths and how the stories kind of change and some of those things. You said this was originally going to be a TV project that you were pitching. Of course, you're not involved on that level on this show. Is it hard to kind of let go if the story does take a strange turn away from your book or it goes in a different place? Or do you just kind of separate yourself totally from it at this point and say, they're doing their version, I've got mine already written, it exists in the way I wanted it? How do you see those two things?
I mean, that was what I always said, was that, yes, my version is on the shelf behind me, and nothing that happens in the TV show can change that. It's one thing to say that, and it's quite another. You really don't know until you see the show, and I'm pleased to discover that, yes, I am one of those apparently rare authors who is not so territorial with his toys that I can't handle an adaptation that isn't a carbon copy of the novel. I mean, I understand completely that some people just have a hard time letting it go and have trouble with certain decisions, but no, I've had a really great time, and I've been pretty good watching the series at setting aside my own preconceptions of stuff, so just being able to enjoy it on its own terms. There were a couple of times where I was surprised by something that just had not occurred to me to do, where I would have to watch an episode maybe twice, just to once so I would know what happened and what didn't happen, and then again to sort of figure out what I really thought, and just to experience it, like a first-time viewer who had no preconceptions at all. But at the end of the day, yeah, I love what they've done, and I don't really, it's just been really kind of exciting, and I'm glad I'm not, I'm able to let it go and not be too concerned about changes. Yeah.
You mentioned, this is your final event for this, and you said it was kind of funny that it ended up being with Tulsa, because obviously Tulsa plays a huge role in the show. And I didn't see that coming at all. Like you said, having read the book, I did find there's a line in the book that says, less friendly parts of the country were populated by ogres and trolls, vampires and werewolves, wild beasts, ghosts, evil sorcerers, and hooded white knights. In Oklahoma, a great white dragon coiled around Tulsa, breathing fire onto the neighborhood where Atticus's father and Uncle George had been born, right? So there's that kind of seed there, right, in the book. But I'm curious, that kind of is like a mini movie almost within this show, right, where it kind of goes in this path, and it's hard not to connect it to what happened in Watchmen, right? So you have these two HBO shows that both are dealing with the Tulsa Race Massacre in very different ways, but at the same time, there are moments where it looks like obviously they're recreating space, but it's like, were they using the same sets here? I don't understand. Some of those, saving some budget on using some of the same things here, but there's this strange moment. We're approaching the centennial of that massacre here in our city next spring. People know about it. Things like these popular culture moments in some ways can be an education for the whole country in a way that no, public radio station thing would work, or a PBS show. Like this just blows it up to a new level. And I'm sure many people don't even maybe realize when they're watching it that this is a real thing that happened. Then they look it up and they find out that it was. But when you see like a real incident like that kind of working its way into the mythology of the broader story, that's kind of where we were talking about. You're just watching it at this point from, kind of the outside looking in, but you look at that, you go, wow, I can't believe they kind of took it in that direction.
No, actually, I mean, that was one of the things. I mean, there is a version of it in the novel as well, obviously, where Montrose, yeah. See, you basically, in order to get something from this dead man, he's basically got to tell a story about what happened to his father. He ends up telling the story of his father's murder on the opening night of the Tulsa massacre, and that was a case where at first that was one of the episodes I had to watch twice, just because it did share certain similarities to what I was talking about in the novel, but obviously took it in a different direction completely. I mean, obviously one of the things being that in the novel, I mean, in the TV show, Montrose is a repressed gay man, and in the novel he is not. But what I realized by the time I watched that episode twice and I got to the end, it's like, it's a very different take on the story, but the point of it is like, it's still an explanation. Like in the novel, the point of that chapter is basically to explain how Montrose became the father that he is and the kind of father that he is. And that's really what the series does too. It just does it by a completely different path and a very different set of specific plot points, but at the end of the day, that's what the payoff is. It's like, yeah, you understand how Montrose, how he chose to become a father and what he sacrificed to get there, and so it fits. So yeah, that was a case where I sort of had to sort of see it once and then go back and I'm like, okay, now let me see if I can really get where they're coming from. And once I did, I was like, oh yeah, and we still are kind of telling the same story here. It's just parallel universe thing. So that was neat.
Yeah. Let's talk for just a second before we wrap up about 88 names.
Sure.
You didn't get a chance to do your book tour. Damn pandemic kind of ruined it this spring, but I
am not going to complain though.
No, it's a small sacrifice, but I think you had like you said you don't write particularly fast. You work on these books for quite some time. That had been obviously something you'd been toiling at for many who knows, years. I don't know how long you're working on that project, but it comes out and you kind of don't get the chance to kind of give it the launch maybe that it needs. But then you kind of get this second wind of this other thing that happens. But just tell our viewers kind of about the newer book and kind of what it's about. And, like you said before, it's hard to make connections, obviously, what to read next and all these things like that. But I think 88 Names was just the knockout book. So maybe just tell people, what it's about and what you were trying to do there.
So 88 Names also actually came out of the same failed TV pitch thing that produced Lovecraft Country. In this case, the idea is it's a story about a guy named John Chu who is a paid guide to online video games. So basically the idea of being, if you're a rich person who wants to play World of Warcraft, but you don't have time to learn how to play an online game, and you can just pay this guy and he will provide you with a ready-made character and a bunch of skilled teammates to sort of take you adventuring for a night, sort of cater an adventure for you. And he gets a new client who's paying him a ridiculous amount of money to give him a comprehensive tour of the world of online virtual reality gaming. And he begins to suspect that this new client is actually the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, who's interested in VR for reasons of his own. And the initial idea for this actually was just, I had this idea for a TV show that would be set entirely in virtual reality so that you would never see what the characters actually looked like in real life, but only see how they chose to present themselves. Because of course in VR, you have complete control over your physical appearance and you have complete control over how you sound. And I posited sort of advanced machine translation where you can pass yourself off as a native speaker of a language you've never studied. So you've got this constant guessing game of who am I really dealing with and what do they really want? And the novel, it's like the first 2/3 are set in virtual reality. So either in chat rooms, so it'd be like a 3D version of this Zoom event we're having right now, or in specific gaming worlds. And it's this cyber thriller, sort of spy thriller, romantic comedy. There's an element of that because John Chu has an ex-girlfriend named Darla that he's got unfinished business with. And this is also a time when cyber sex is a thing. So he's never met her in real life either. They just have had this very twisted relationship online, and then they broke up, and now she's vowed revenge. So he's got to worry about her at the same time he's worried about North Korea and this other character who may or may not be an agent of the Chinese government. So it's this cat and mouse game in cyberspace, and then finally in the last third of the novel we come out into real life and all the masks come off and we see who's who and what's what. So yeah, it's definitely a lighter story than Lovecraft Country, but there's still plenty of stuff to chew on involving identity and just the way people behave when they think they won't be held accountable for it. And I tried very hard to make it obviously video gaming looms large in the novel because it's a guy who works in that field, but you don't have to be a gamer or have ever played a video game to get something out of it. I think it works just as well as as a interpersonal story, as a character-driven drama. So I tried very hard to make it accessible to people who have no idea what World of Warcraft is. You will learn everything you need to know from because it's told from the first person of a professional guide, so you will not get lost.
Well, like we said, timing's everything. This book drops, and then 2 weeks later, everyone's living in little boxes, looking at each other on the screen like never before. We're living in more of a virtual world than we ever have, in this moment that we're living in right now. So, well,
and that actually immunized me a little bit from the effects of the pandemic in the sense that I had, we'd already planned plenty of promotional events with 88 Names that were going to take place online anyway. So I was a bit ahead of the curve on that. We did a podcast where we talked to a bunch of people in the VR world. That was really cool, and you can still go look that up. And I did my first ever virtual reality interview with a guy for something called the Drax Files Radio Hour. So my host was in Germany, I was in Seattle wearing a pair of Oculus glasses, and we were conversing in this virtual space that looked like a recording studio that, decorated with virtual copies of my books. And I was wearing an avatar inspired by Bad Monkeys. So it's me with a mandrill head and wearing a jean jacket. So yeah, so I did get to do a lot of stuff anyway, but obviously it's nice to actually be able to get out and meet people and meet booksellers. So I'm looking forward to a time when that will be possible again.
Yeah, same here. Last question is this. Have you gotten a chance to read more or the same as usual over this quarantine period? And tell us something that you've read over the last 5-6 months that just knocked you out. Just something, it's the last thing you read that you just loved.
I have actually been reading very, very little this year because I just find it so hard to focus on anything for a long time. I mean, I've started a lot of books, but I keep setting them aside. And I did do an event with Christopher Moore. He's an old friend now for San Francisco's Litquake, and so he had his new book out, Shakespeare for Squirrels. So I read that, but then there was another book he had talked about with me before that I had never read called Island of the Sequined Love Nun, which is it involves cargo cults and Micronesia, and it's just this wild story. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but I read that and I wasn't sure because I wasn't sure whether I was going to get into it or not, and it just kind of blew me away. So it's inspired by Chris. Actually, at some point in the past, took a trip out to a remote part of Micronesia and met with folks out there and spent some time out there, and he drew on those experiences to tell this wild story of this disgraced pilot who gets hired to fly for a missionary in Micronesia, and it just gets weirder from there. So cargo cults get involved, and anyway, I won't spoil it, but if you haven't read that, I would recommend that to people. It's a really good book.
And they don't make him like Christopher Moore is a one of one. They don't make many like him. He's very unique. The only person I could compare him to would be someone like a Tom Robbins or somebody like that.
Yeah, he's very much in the same tradition.
Yeah. Fun stuff. Well, I really appreciate you taking a minute. Thanks for like ending your little book tour with us, and we just love what you do. And I hope everything's going great for you. And hopefully, at some point down the road, we'll have you back in a real in-person kind of way.
I would love to come to Tulsa at some point when when it's safe to go anywhere. But yeah, but thank you very much for having me, and thank you for everybody for coming. So
yeah, thanks everybody. Stay safe. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye bye.
Take it easy.